Hey everyone, welcome back to another video. This one is long overdue, but I finally got the potential for Wolverine to T4 and thoroughly tested him at level 70, level 80, and at T4. This was one of the characters that I had to wait the longest to get the potential unlocked, which was pretty brutal, but fortunately I got a lot of testing in so I can share all of the findings that I have with you. I'd say that most people probably have Wolverine's uniform and him built up by now, especially if they're fans of PvP. However, I'll go through the different builds that I tested against and the ones that I tested to give you a breakdown of which build you might want to use in what particular mode, because some of them excel more at one mode than another. And besides that, because the character is so strong in PvP, I'll also cover some of the counters in things like Timeline as well as Alliance Conquest. Because I already had a brilliant CTP of Greed on Wolverine, that is what I tested the character with throughout all of the content. However, I also got clips from other players who used various different builds as well as fought different Wolverines with other builds, so I have a pretty good idea of how he functions with those, and I'll give you recommendations later in the video in which build you might want to use for what mode. As a bit of a spoiler, the character doesn't really do that great in PvE, especially at level 70. He does a little bit better at level 80, but for the most part, I'll just be showing you what the character can do on the tests that I did with the Brilliant Greed at level 70 and 80, and obviously at T4 as well. But most of the testing will be limited to the PvP side, since that is where the character excels in. The main issue with the character in PvE is that he doesn't really have too many skills that can cancel on top of one another. He basically just has one, so he doesn't nearly do enough damage on the other skills as standalone to make up for the lack of skills that can be stacked on and layered on top of one another. You can see that in this first test, even with that basically 110% proc, since I have a 220 with the Greed, but it's only on half the time, so it's basically like having 110% proc. Even with that, I wasn't able to clear the first phase in that 2-minute window to be able to complete the fight entirely, and he was very late and basically almost ended up failing the fight entirely because of the time limitation that the fight has. I'm not entirely sure if Greed even does anything in Alliance Battle Extreme, but it seems that the number of hits that the character has, and with the great setup that you have on the Combat Hero Day, where you can use She-Hulk's leadership, and any kind of support like Sif or even Valkyrie, really does end up giving him a decent score if you don't really have too many options for this day. But building the character specifically for ABX I think is a mistake, since there are far better options like Moon Knight or Venom, and the character will suffer in PvP, where he has the most value if you do choose to build him in that way. He can solo giant boss raid when he has the type advantage even at level 70, but I have a pretty stacked build and he only finished it with 30 seconds to spare, the first phase, which means that if you have a lesser build, he's probably going to struggle, which kind of highlights the fact that he's not really that great for PvE. At level 80, the character gets that needed improvement in World Boss Legend that actually allows him to complete the first phase of Knull about 1 minute and 20 seconds faster this time, and then complete the fight entirely with about 1 minute and 10 seconds left. I did go to a pretty high stage of Mephisto to test him at level 80. I did stage 79, and unfortunately he wasn't able to clear the first phase in that 60-second window to be able to win the fight. He was slow by about 60 seconds, so at T4 he should be able to complete it, as you'll see in the clips later on. He was able to complete a stage 49 with Ultron, but that's mostly because he didn't have a type disadvantage like he did in the Mephisto fight, and because the stage was much lower than that. I also did a stage 34 of the Dark Phoenix World Boss Legend just to get an idea of how he would do. I knew that he probably wouldn't be able to complete it, and that was basically what happened. I was able to do the first phase within about 4 minutes, and he was nowhere close to being able to finish it, even at level 80. The character is a half-cost native tier 2, so he will be a little bit more expensive than other regular T4s to build up. You can see the costs to my materials and gold in these two screenshots before and after. It basically cost me around 7.5 thousand carbonadium, since that is the limiting factor, to upgrade the character to T4 from level 80. The T4 stat bump that he gets is pretty standard. He got about 12,000 physical damage increase for my account, around 25,000 HP increase, And the biggest increase was obviously the instinct, which bumped up to around 4,300 total. Aside from the instinct increase, which I have a pretty high value because I have a maxed out level 6 artifact, is the HP increase, which is much better this time around at T4 than it was at T3. The T3 stat bump is pretty bad for a combat type, and the T4 kind of makes up for it a bit, but overall I think that the health he has as a combat type is still a little bit behind some of the other combat types that have a standard higher value. In terms of what strikers to use for the character, as you can see from this clip, I'm using Thor when I was testing him in PvE, since Thor is one of the best PvE strikers for pretty much any character despite the instinct type, but fortunately for Wolverine, the instinct matches with Thor's kind of strikers, so you get the max value for your T4 skill as well. For PvP though, I would say that the best striker you could use for him is Jean Grey, again because the instinct types match, and because Jean Grey provides you that iframe ignore for the striker skill, and the super guard break, meaning that when Wolverine activates that skill, he'll be able to lock down the opponent and hit them even if they are in iframe. Once you get the character to T4 is when he gets any kind of value in PvE, since he gets that 80% increased attack on the T4 skill, as well as the 20% increase to the value of the different buffs, including that 80% attack, but also all of the procs and buffs that he has on his skills 1 through 5, as well as the inside proc and even his own CTP proc. At this point, if you do want to build the character for PvE, which again I wouldn't recommend because he does so much better in PvP, then a CTP of Rage is likely your most ideal option, considering that you have to delay cancel the third skill, and because he doesn't have many skills to layer on top of one another for him to be considered proc friendly. You can see that at T4 he gets a major improvement in PvE, since I was able to complete this same stage about 2 minutes faster than when he was at level 80. Surprisingly, the improvement is good enough for the character to not only complete the first phase within that 60-second window, but also complete the entirety of the Mephisto fight on stage 79, even with that brilliant greed and not an actual proper proc build like a Rage or even an Obelisk that has that new Rage-like proc. Versus Ultron, he completes the same stage around 1 minute and 20 seconds faster with that T4. And I have to say that although it's kind of unfortunate that the character isn't really designed for PvE, since he doesn't really keep up with some of the other options, the character does actually do pretty well in PvE for 2 major reasons. One of them is because of that immortal artifact, you can actually keep attacking some of the bosses even when they have those one-shot mechanics, since you can survive it and keep doing damage to kind of bypass some of the phases, like Ultron's one for example. And the other one is that most bosses in World Boss Legend tend to move around a lot, causing your character to lose tracking, so your skills won't do damage and you might end up missing an entire proc. However, with Wolverine's 5th skill, the tracking is amazing and he can pretty much go anywhere on the map even if you started attacking and the character jumps somewhere else. And if you really need to reposition and you already used up that immortal effect once, you also have the benefit of the 2nd skill, which you can reposition the character after he attacks to avoid any additional damage. It's unfortunate that the character doesn't excel too much in PvE. Even at T4, I wasn't able to complete stage 34 of the Dark Phoenix World Boss Legend, but with the immense amount of value that the character has in PvP, I can kind of understand why they did this. Again, there are better options in Alliance Battle Extreme for the Combat Hero Day, and I wouldn't recommend building Wolverine specifically for that. However, if you don't have many T4s and Wolverine is one of your first ones, then you can get dual usage for him in that mode as well, especially when you have Thor as a striker. It really adds up the points much more, and you can see that with that CTP of Greed, which again I don't know if it actually does anything in ABX, I was able to get around 2 million more from level 70 up to the new T4. You can also see the PvE improvement highlighted in the Giant Boss Raid Dormammu fight. I was able to complete the first phase 40 seconds faster with the T4, and then complete the fight entirely with that Greed within about 4 minutes total, or with around 6 minutes left. The rotation for the character is pretty standard. You do your 1 and 2 cancel to build up charge for your T3 and your T4. Then you do your 3rd skill and delay cancel it by about a half second or till you see the animation start. and it will give you a damage increase to all of your skills. Then you do a 4th skill and cancel that and go into your 5th skill. So it gives you further charge for your T3 and T4, and the 5th skill is generally what you want to stay in when you have any kind of proc up. During odd rotations, your 5th skill might still be on cooldown, so for that you just stay in your 4th skill till the 5th is off cooldown. And once you have your T3 skill, you just cancel all of those skills, 3, 4, and 5, into that T3 skill. And when you have your T4 skill available, you just use that whenever it's up, so you can get that increase to attack as well as the other increases to your buffs. So that is what the character can do in PvE, but the PvP testing is likely what more people are interested in, considering that that is what Wolverine excels at. For this, I tested the character at level 70 and at T4 in timeline, as well as how he does on manual, and ways to counter him when he is in the lead position and in a different position on the timeline team. On top of that, I also tested the character in Alliance Conquest, as well as how to counter him in Alliance Conquest, and how he performs in Otherworld, both at level 70 and at T4. When the patch notes initially dropped, people were saying that the character wouldn't be very good because they barely changed anything in his kit, aside from the 5th skill now having an iframe ignore instead of the 3rd skill, and the skill not being a counter anymore. However, I know a lot of times that looking at patch notes, it doesn't really reveal everything, and I speculated that the 5th skill would likely get something extra added to it to make the character very tough and basically difficult to deal with in PvP. Before the patch dropped, I basically speculated that if they added something like super guard break to the 5th skill, and if the 5th skill still maintained that full iframe, because the character's AI usually prioritizes the 5th skill anyway, even when it didn't have an iframe ignore, that the character would basically just be really overpowered, because he would instantly go into the 5th skill that would lock the opponent down with the super guard break, and he would be fully protected being in an iframe himself. And lo and behold, that's the change that they did. The 5th skill has super guard break on it, it is a full iframe, and because it is an iframe ignore, the AI prioritizes it, and the character will always start with that 5th skill, which a lot of times will end up taking out at least one life of the opponent or activate the immortal artifact if they have any of those. You can see just from these clips that even though the character might end up dying to an Adam or a Jean sometimes, the fact that he can take out any character in the game just at level 70 shows you how amazing he is in PvP, and is now in the top 3 spot for PvP characters in the game, and arguably in the top spot for 3 vs 3 format PvP modes like Otherworld, Alliance Tournament, Battle World, and even Alliance Conquest, which I would say he is the toughest to take down. Just note that Wolverine's artifact is essential for his PvP status. If you don't have his artifact, then he loses a ton of value in PvP, and I would argue he isn't even possibly in the top 5 without it. One of the reasons why the character isn't in the top spot in timeline compared to the other modes is because that 5th skill has a high initial cooldown, and because it is your main damage dealing skill and has the iframe ignore, you basically either have to burn one activation of the immortal artifact or keep swapping characters or have some other characters initially, so the 5th skill starts off cooldown. When you have the character on defense, it's not really an issue because that cooldown limitation doesn't apply, but when you have him in offense and characters like Jean and Adam Warlock are in the game and have a short cooldown on their 2nd skill, they'll be able to activate that first and burn at least one activation of your immortal artifact, meaning that you just end up being a single life character at that point. When you get the character to T4, he actually does gain a ton of value because he has the higher health pool, he can heal more constantly with his passive healing, but on top of that, with the immortal artifact, he functions much better than other characters that have something like a revive, for example, because if he goes down to 0 health, other characters would have died and would have had their T4 and T3 reset, but Wolverine actually gets the benefit of the T4, which also gives him that added health that he was missing from the subpar T3 upgrade, which means his healing is even higher, as well as his damage and other buff effects, including the penetration and stuff. But on top of that, the T4 skill will also activate the Striker, which if it is Jean Grey, will iframe ignore and lock down the opponent, which could give you enough time to go into your skills or enough damage for you to finish off a character. If you paid close attention to the testing that I had with character level 70, you'll see that at T4, I don't end up losing some of the same fights because he gains enough health so that the immortal artifact doesn't activate, or I have enough burst damage to actually take out the opponent much quicker before they do the activation of the immortal artifact in that way. If you're wondering what build to use on Wolverine, the one that I found to be the most ideal for PvP overall and the most useful in most PvP game modes is a CTP of Greed, and even more so if you can get a mighty version of it. The reason for using a CTP of Greed is because he already has penetration in his kit and his survival is already good. He has a decent amount of damage mitigation, he has passive healing, he has the immortal artifact, so that means if you can get a mighty CTP of Greed, you can activate the ambush effect and get that super guard break immunity, which is very useful for most meta characters that basically try to lock you down and kill you that way, so he can break out of that. But on top of that, he can also ignore a lot of the damage mitigation stacking that occurs with supports and steal effect from authority, and he becomes immune to one of his counters, which is physical reflect. In addition to this, because the character opens with the 5th skill in most PvP modes, you can get immediate use of that proc effect versus the opponent. So even if it's someone like Adam Warlock or Thanos that has a little bit extra mitigation versus Wolverine because they either have the type advantage or because they have other supports, he will be able to cut through them pretty quickly. And because you have that immortal effect, you can guarantee at least one activation of the proc and one activation of the ambush effect. Although I think a proc based build is the most ideal for him throughout most PvP modes, in Timeline specifically, a Steel Authority might be a bit better because it gives you some extra survival time so that the immortal artifact isn't activated right away for your 5th skill to come off cooldown and for you to be able to use it. Usually in Timeline, because you can use the character on manual, you don't really need to have a ton of high damage and proc damage because you can control what skills he activates and you can kind of stack up these skills and procs to be able to take out the opponent even without a damage proc. So even though I think a CTP of Greed will give you the most value overall and you can make him work in Timeline with it, if you want to go with a more tanky build in general, then a Steel Authority would probably be the most ideal option first, before a Vitality Refinement or even a Regen. Regen is kind of out of the question now for top meta characters because most of them have super guard break and Regen doesn't really give you any protection for that. Between the Mighty Authority and the Mighty Refinement, I would lean towards the Mighty Authority because the character's damage mitigation is at 25%. If you just try to go with healing as your main source of survival, you won't really do that well because the opponent will be able to damage you faster than you can heal, so you'd basically have to have a support to get that mitigation high enough so that the healing outpaces the damage that they do. And if they have something like CTP of Greed, then it'll become even harder for you to survive in that way. On the flip side, for a Steel Authority, you can use another support and the Steel Authority with his mitigation and potentially get to the max mitigation value that way, which will give you a ton of survival. And if the opponent does have a Greed, they would still need to activate the ambush effect to be able to bypass that mitigation that you get. So you can basically get higher mitigation and have the healing as your source of survival, as opposed to just healing itself with low mitigation, which the opponent will be able to overcome. However, they might not be able to if your mitigation is high and you have a little bit of healing. So it's basically the flip of what the refinement provides, and I think it would give you more survival overall. But again, Greed would still be the most ideal option in all modes because the proc in a 3 vs 3 format would just take out everyone, and taking out an opponent means that you don't really have to deal with survival if they're already dead, since you won't be taking any damage. When playing the character on manual, you essentially want to use other characters first to give you enough time for the 5th skill to come off cooldown, and if you're facing someone like an Adam or a Jean first, then you want to wait till they use their burst skill before swapping into Wolverine so that he doesn't take any damage and have that immortal artifact activated right away. And then you basically just go into your 5th skill to take out their first life. When they respawn, they might activate your immortal artifact, but then you just do the 5th skill again to take them out. And then if you're facing a Jean as the next character, you essentially always want to open with the 3rd skill with Wolverine. It'll make you immune to her super guard break. and then you instantly cancel that into either the 4th or 5th and easily take out another life of her, and then do the same thing when she respawns. Move to the other side of the arena, use the 3rd skill, and then the 4th or 5th take her out. To counter Wolverine in the starting spot, one of the things you can do is use Gore in the lead spot because he is immune to super guard break at all times. You can basically just walk away from Wolverine using the 5th skill. Then when you see Wolverine doing that long slash attack from the 5th skill, then you can start attacking him. Otherwise, if you start attacking him right away, the 5th will move around and retarget you. That should have burned the immortal artifact the first time. From there, once you respawn, you want to do a 5 cancel or 3 cancel into the 2nd skill to keep the character locked down and do enough damage to burn him down as soon as the immortal artifact kind of ends the cooldown, so he ends up dying. If you end up messing up the timing for the first attack and don't get any damage in to activate his artifact initially, then you basically just want to spawn in doing that 3 or 5 cancel into 2 to activate his artifact. Then when you inevitably die, you want another character like Jean to spawn in, where you want to go immediately into the 2nd skill followed by a 5th, 4th, or 3rd, and that should do enough damage by that point for his artifact to have burned out and for you to be able to take him out. Alternatively, you could also dodge the 5th attack from Wolverine initially and then immediately switch to Adam when he targets you and use your 2nd skill that should burn his artifact. However, you might end up dying, but if you don't, then on the 2nd life you should be able to take out Wolverine. The only downside here is that if you do lose a life and the opponent has an Adam on their team, it might be difficult to win the fight entirely. If you're having a lot of trouble with Wolverines that aren't in the starting position, one of the strategies you can use is to have a Reflect stacked team with Colossus and Emma, as well as Adam Warlock as your main damage dealer to deal with everyone else. Initially, when facing a character like Adam, you can swap to Emma about a half second after he begins his attack, which will reflect all of that damage back to him to take the first life. Then in the 2nd life, you just switch to your own Adam and use your counter skill to take him out. Dealing with Jean afterwards is pretty easy. After you've activated your 2nd skill to get that iframe ignore, you just go into the 4th skill, which has the invincible and will make you immune to the super guard break that she hits you with from the 2nd skill, allowing you to avoid most of that damage while also being able to burst her down. When she respawns, you do the same thing. You do a quick cancel of the 2nd skill and go into the 5th skill this time if your 4th is on cooldown. Then when Wolverine spawns in, you'll likely lose 1 life, so you just use the 2nd skill immediately to activate his immortal artifact on the 2nd life. Then you can swap out to one of the other characters to either reflect him down, or if they end up dying, you'll spawn back into Adam and you just activate the 2nd skill again to take out the 2nd life or the life after the immortal artifact for Wolvie. One of the other niche strategies you can use is to have Hela on the team instead of Emma. I don't think it works nearly as well, but it is still viable. So you can either have Hela in the leadership position to give you that extra damage to Warlock, or you can have Colossus to give you that physical immunity versus Wolverine. But either way, you want to have either of those characters in the beginning and swap to Colossus before going into Warlock to deal with most of the team, so that once you get to Wolverine, there comes a point where Colossus will have his awakening skill available so that you can use it on top of the Reflect to take out Wolverine's 1 life of his artifact, and then potentially also his 2nd life by staying in that awakening skill while also reflecting damage to him. The extra mitigation that you get from Hela as well as Colossus will make you very tanky so you can reflect back, and Adam Warlock will also get a ton of mitigation versus Wolverine because he gets it from Hela, from Colossus, and because he has the type advantage. So unless the Wolverine has that ambush proc activate, he's going to have trouble cutting through Adam, especially if you use your 5th skill in a full iframe to hide from the damage as well. In Alliance Conquest, Wolverine is essentially the best character in the game now because of that immortal effect, and when you take him to T4, he gets the benefit of the T3 and the T4 skill, and unlike the revive characters like Jean and Adam Warlock, you have to take out both of his kind of pseudo lives to be able to wipe him from the board. You can't just take out 1 life like you can with Adam or Jean by using a reflect character, so it's a lot more difficult to kill him. You can see even at level 70 with a nonsensical team, having just a debuff and a random health support, that greed build is essentially able to cut through any T4 character. Because you're most likely going to fight Wolverine in the typical Adam Molecule Man Wolverine team, basically all of the top meta teams work to be able to take those out, but it comes down to an RNG chance. So you can have, for example, the Carnage set with Carnage and Agent Venom, and I would say an Energy Reflect, like Destroyer, for example, that could potentially wipe that team or beat it. Another that can beat it is someone like Jean, America Chavez, and Emma, but again, it comes down to RNG. And then for the most part, I would say that your best bet is to basically split Adam and Wolverine into two separate teams to take out more of those sets, because either of them can basically win that fight. If you have Adam with someone like a Spidey instead of Wolverine in the Molecule Man set, then he is able to take out Adam quickly and activate Wolverine's first life from the artifact, and then he'll probably end up dying, but end up winning in the second fight or when he respawns. Similarly, pairing Wolverine with someone like Doom and a Reflect character will be able to take out Adam's life quickly while also keeping Wolverine alive for that immortal artifact to not activate as quickly, so that he can eventually end up winning that fight as well. I realize that at this time Wolverine is actually banned in Otherworld, but when he wasn't, he was basically the best character in that mode, since he was, again, able to wipe out everyone with just that 5th skill, lock them down, huge AoE, and just has great survival. So you can see here, I actually was able to get in the first spot for Otherworld for multiple weeks, or at least for 1 week. I'm also in the top spot this week as well, on and off with people attacking. But I was able to do that with level 70 Wolverine while people still had T4 one, so that just shows you how strong the character is just at a base level. Once I got the character to T4, he became even more consistent and had the benefit of also activating the T4 skill to get extra damage, get the extra health, and get the striker hitting the opponent, while also being able to go into that T3 skill more often. CTP of Greed that I recommended is also highlighted in Otherworld, where you can see that the character can burst down multiple opponents with that proc active, and because he can go into the ambush effect multiple times, he is also immune to some of the physical reflect characters that the opponent can use. And also you can bypass the mitigation stacking that the opponent can use, since a lot of the strategies are basically to use 1 or 2 good characters and just stack a bunch of supports to get mitigation and damage up. There's 2 other things that I forgot to mention before I wrap up the review. One of them is that with this uniform, Wolverine's striker skill now changes to whatever it was before. It's now the 5th skill, which has that iframe ignore and that super guard break lockdown, so it becomes an amazing option for other T4 characters, striker options, like Jean, for example, who can get that reflect and also have Wolverine come out and do the super guard break, lockdown, and iframe ignore damage. Gets pretty crazy. The other thing is that if you are in timeline challenger level, Wolverine does end up dropping a few spots in usability because his immortal artifact doesn't work when you combine some of the buffs that you get at that level, so he isn't nearly as good in timeline, like I mentioned before, as he is in other PvP modes. Overall, I could basically just sum up this review by saying if you care about PvP in any capacity, then you definitely want to pick up Wolverine, since he is top meta in numerous PvP modes. And if you don't, then you don't really have to consider this uniform at all, but you are definitely going to end up fighting against him in PvP modes if you play those in any way. So that pretty much wraps up the review for Wolverine. I did mention a bunch of different things like potential builds and ways to counter him, since he is kind of a nuisance in some of the PvP modes, so hopefully people find that useful. If you have any questions regarding these or anything else, just make sure to leave that in the comment section down below, and I'll try to get back to you as soon as I can. As always, if you found the video useful, please consider liking, subscribing, and possibly sharing it with others. I'm sure that they would probably find it useful as well. I always appreciate people taking the time to watch these, even if they do come out a week or 2 later, so thank you. But the video is now over.